I'm going to show you how to master HTTP requests and webhooks inside n8n, even if you've never worked with APIs before. Connecting to external data is probably the single most important skill you'll need to learn inside n8n, and it unlocks virtually any integration you'll ever need. But most people feel totally lost when they hear terms like API, endpoint, or post request. So in this video, I'll break down exactly how HTTP requests work, show you real examples with actual business tools, and walk you through creating your first API calls, all in simple language anyone can understand. So let's get started with the basics of HTTP requests. And as a side note, if you're looking for more exclusive content, then check out the link to my community in the description below. Next is such a critical concept, which is accessing data that's not inside n8n. So n8n has maybe 1,000 inbuilt nodes, maybe less. And actually, when we're working with business systems, we're always going to need to access data out of n8n. So today we're going to cover API, HTTP requests, how to use them, and common errors. And to demonstrate this example, I'm going to run through some key concepts first, and then I'm going to go to a template, which is completely free, that's going to teach us all about API fundamentals, and we can see it step by step. So first and foremost, what even are HTTP requests or API calls? Well, when we can't access the data that we want inside pre-built, inbuilt nodes inside n8n, we effectively need to reach out to external systems to get that data. So say you're working with an accounting software like FreeAgent that doesn't have an n8n inbuilt node. What we can do, for example, is go FreeAgent. I'm sure there's one for QuickBooks in here, QuickBooks Online, but for example, FreeAgent, there isn't one. So if we needed to access that service, we'd effectively want to grab our data from there, and we need to effectively manipulate or call that system in order to retrieve our data. And FreeAgent will have a set of predefined, what are called endpoints, that we can reach out to grab data in a structured way from them. So it's effectively like scraping a website where we pull data, except for the fact that FreeAgent has defined this is the way in which we will pass you data back. And you're able to do that, and we'll give you an API key to prove it's you doing it. So if we have an example n8n workflow here, we have a trigger. We then want to grab the data from FreeAgent, for example, or another site. We're going to process the data and then output. So the way in which we do the HTTP request or API is use this HTTP request node, which you might be familiar with. And all that's doing is effectively saying, give me that data, or I'm going to send data to you. And what you're going to do is provide me with a response, whether that response be the data I'm requesting, or whether that response be to confirm that the action I wanted it to take has happened. So there's a few methods that we can use inside n8n or any API request. The first is a GET request. And by the way, these are all very, very straightforward once you understand the concepts. The first is a GET request, which, as it sounds, is retrieving data from a system. So in our FreeAgent example, we say, what were my transactions in the last month? If we're posting data, we're actually creating new data in the system. So we might be sending an invoice or text or something to our FreeAgent software. If we are updating data, we'd use a method called put and patch. And you can see these are all capitalized, and they will always be capitalized. And then finally, we can remove data. So as it sounds, it's delete. And here's some examples of how we would do that. So we would send a GET request, it's called, to actually retrieve data. So we might get the users list from our software. We might post or send a new user data, and that they would then be registered and set up in the system. And we need to do that in a certain format. We might update a user with certain details. We might delete a user. But what we're going to receive back from the API call is actually a return message. So every time we contact an API, the provider is going to set up a return message, which tells us, was our mission successful or was it failure? So we have these different error codes that often come up. The ones starting in 2s are successful. You don't really need to worry about the letters, or sorry, the numbers after the 2. But if it's 2, we know it's a success. If it's 4, we effectively couldn't do it, and the error is on our side, so the client side. So for example, we've got 404 not found. So when you try and access a website and it comes up with 404 not found, we can have the same if we try to contact an endpoint or a URL that doesn't exist. We effectively will get this response back to tell us it had failed. And then there's all sorts of other errors, but they start with 4, and it shows us that actually we've done something wrong. Whereas 5 errors, or errors that start in 5, are server errors. So if we try to access a service, it comes back with an error with 5, then it's often on their side that the issue is happening. So we'll jump back to this diagram here, which is the n8n API endpoints integration. We talked a little bit about accessing certain endpoints. So endpoints are just URLs. So if, for example, we want to retrieve the users, then we will have a base URL followed by an endpoint. So the base URL might be freeagent.com or whatever their website is. But the endpoint that we're trying to contact is the user's endpoint, which is /API /v1 /users. And we'll cover that in the n8n example. But again, we'll have multiple endpoints for different information that we want to get, post, delete, update. And then the only additional thing you need to know are around headers. So often when we're trying to access data, the system needs to understand that the request is coming from us in order to stay secure. So we need to pass headers in the form of authorization. So what we're saying here is actually, here's my API key to prove who I am. And it's like showing your ID card effectively to give you permission to access that content. We then sometimes send additional headers, although n8n actually does this automatically for us. So we don't always need to do this, which is I'm sending JSON data, which is a content type header. And then please send this type of data back, which will be JSON. And this will always, by default, in n8n, be JSON data being sent and JSON data being received. So we often don't even need to define these. You just need to worry about how to set up your authorization. So let's jump into a really clear example now. And the way you can do that is go to the n8n template library, and you're just going to go learn API fundamentals. And this again is a template set up by Lucas Peyrin. And he's got some really great beginners templates. And we're going to run through that template. It's going to appear as a page like this, which gives you more info. And all we're going to do is just copy that whole thing and paste that into a brand new workflow inside n8n. And we're just going to make sure it's activated. Right now, mine's deactivated. And we're going to run through the fundamental concepts of actually sending a request using a really basic example and the different concept we just covered, but in practice, so that you can implement it with absolutely any API. And if you're looking for more resources around handling more complex cases like file uploads, authorization, anything that's slightly more complex than this use case, we cover that in the school community linked in the description as well. So it starts off the tutorial with what is an API. And actually, we're going to go over a very clear example, and we'll show you both HTTP requests and webhooks as well, and talk about the difference between them. But actually, you'll see how to use both inside n8n. And once you understand this, it's really going to clear up how to access data outside of n8n. So think of an API, like we've covered the fundamentals already, like you are making a request. So you are the client and you're using this HTTP request node, which you can get by just typing HTTP in the tab here. And effectively, we want something. We either want to get data, like we talked about, we want to send data, delete data, or update data. And if we think about this like we are ordering at a restaurant, the kitchen is the server. So the kitchen is our free agent example, which is our accounting software that's going to send us back information. So we'll treat it like us ordering from a kitchen and the kitchen sending something back. And then the API is effectively the way we communicate that. So in a restaurant, that would be the waiter. And also it would be through a menu. We can't just order something off menu because we'd get rejected. So we have to order on menu. And the on menu in this case is actually our API documentation. So whenever we connect to a service like Free Agent, we would go to their API documentation. And we're not actually going to use Free Agent as an example, but you would see the API docs and it would tell you what's on the menu. And you can see that this is a pretty comprehensive menu here, but actually we could effectively find the API docs where it would tell us what URL to reach out to, so what endpoint, but also what information to send in order to get the right information back. So we're going to cover that with examples here. And once you've drag and dropped this workflow into your environment, you just need to make sure that it's an active workflow so that the webhooks are going to work. And what we're going to do is just get it to execute from the start tutorial node. And that should successfully execute all of these nodes in here. And we'll go through all the different requests and what exactly they mean. But one thing you have to define first is this base URL. So when you download the template initially, it will have a dynamic bit of data in there. This dynamic bit of data might not work for you. It didn't work for me, so I've updated it. So instead of the dynamic bit of data, what I've done is just gone to the first webhook over here, gone to the production URL here. I've copied that, and you're going to need to do the same probably. And you're going to go into this webhook here, open this up. Let me just check that I have done the correct thing. Yeah, we're going to copy and paste that in, but we're just going to get rid of menu on the end. So you're going to end up with your instance URL, your server URL, webhook tutorial API. And what we're doing by doing that is just defining that this is the service we're going to send it to. So we're actually, in some weird way, sending it to our own server so that it can send us information back. And the way we're doing that is we are sending information to a HTTP request to our own server up here. And even if you've got a different domain, like I've got n8n.scrapes.ai, it's still going to contact your actual end server URL unless you've totally changed that, because the webhook, we're basically trying to get the webhook to send us information back. So just quickly, the differences on API requests versus webhook. You can think of an API or HTTP request as us reaching out for information. You can think of a webhook as information being pushed back to us. So say, for example, you took payments through Stripe. You could set up a webhook where every time a payment comes in, immediately Stripe sends you the information, and that would be the webhook, this little node here, pushing information back to you. So when we set up a webhook trigger inside n8n, again, we just open up and we say webhook, we're effectively saying that, okay, Stripe, push to this production URL. So we put that in Stripe somewhere. And actually, Stripe would send information to this webhook. So if we had our workflows active, our webhook would receive that data. We could take information with it. Whereas this is actually a push request where we're sending data. So we've got send data, HTTP/API request, receive data, which is webhook. And we've got to set the webhook up. But here we're acting out actually both sides, because we're sending data to our own instance. And therefore, by default, we're receiving data. So we're sending data to this webhook effectively. So we can actually see what that webhook would respond. So in the first example, let's just talk about the basics. We've talked about the GET request and the URL. So inside this HTTP request, we've got no authentication because actually we've not put this behind any barriers. But normally we'd need to, with a service, set up an authentication type, and that will all be in the API docs. It's usually a generic credential type, header auth. And if we open up this, you can see I've got loads of header auths in here. Create new credential. We don't need to do this for this example. We would say, okay, let's use the free agent example. We'll call it 3-agent header auth. And usually 99% of the time, the name would be authorization. And the value, if we just hit expression here, would be the word bearer with a capital B, underscore, and it would be your API key here. And you'd grab the API key from the service. It's not always going to be that, but 99% of the time, it honestly will be that. And you change that to fixed so that it doesn't show your value. And then you'd save that in there, but I'm not going to save that now. And it would say in the authorization section of the API documentation exactly what that would be. So we're going to go back to the example here. And what we're doing is effectively, we are saying, if I just remove this authentication type, we're sending no parameters inside here. So this is the simplest type of request. We are using the get method, and we don't need to worry about all of these right now. But what we're saying is, from this endpoint, send me information. So it's just grabbing the endpoint, which is, as you can see, our base URL from the previous node. So we're saying pull information from here. And this is effectively saying that this is the endpoint. So we've got our base URL here, and then the endpoint is our tutorial/API/menu. So what it's going to do is it's going to respond with this information. So we've told it to respond with pizza and price of 12. So our menu here. So once we say get and we contact the correct endpoint, which is our tutorial/API/menu, it's going to push back this menu here. So when we run this, although you don't see this running, it effectively has run. It's run in a production environment, and it's sent us back that information. So if we go into here, we've received back item and 12. And then if we go to our production executions up here, we should see that this has actually been executed. So you can see that all of our executions of these HTTP requests, but actually you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which are our 5 branches, have all executed independently because the workflow is active, and we've sent requests to these different webhooks. So if I zoom in now, you can see that immediately afterwards, 18 milliseconds after the first execution, that this received the data we sent, which was just a GET request to the correct path. And you can see it's got no parameters, nothing in it. And it's just saying it's come from this host, which is our server, effectively. And then it's just responded with that information. So it's sent pizza and 12. And then if we go back into our what we've actually received, it will be pizza and 12. So By default, we've executed a GET request to pull information, and this has just acted as a dummy, sending back two pieces of information, the price and the item on the menu, which is pizza and 12. Now let's talk about when we actually want to customize the parameters and customize specific things, and that might have conditions in the webhook that's responded. So let's say, again, no authentication here, but we want to place an order. So we're going to contact the order endpoint. And what we're doing is, again, it's just a simple GET request. So we're getting information and we're basically saying, okay, I want to pass in that information query, which is, can I have extra cheese, please? And it's going to respond back to us a success message of, okay, you've ordered pizza with extra cheese. So we can see in the webhook that's going to send back that effectively it's got this condition here. If extra cheese in the query is true, then respond with pizza with extra cheese, which is the condition we got. And then actually, if not, then it's going to respond with plain. So if we put extra cheese as false, you'll see that the webhook is going to send data back as, plain pizza. Let's just execute that again. Plain pizza is returned. So we've contacted the service, which in this case is our own webhook, and that has sent information back to us. Quite a clever way of testing out different API use cases, but usually you'd be contacting an external system. Now let's talk about posting data or sending new data. So quite often you'll be updating data. So say, for example, in our free agent accounting software, we might be sending an invoice in order to map it to a certain example. So we're going to use the post method in here. And then inside the body, we're going to tick send body. We're actually going to send JSON data. So we're going to send the customer review. So we're going to send it to the review endpoint. And you'll see that this will have a path of review at the end. And effectively what we're doing is actually just sending a comment there. So we are posting that information, and that information will be received by the server. So we might post a file to free agent, and that would receive the file and confirm back to us that it's received the file. So if we run this, again, we'll just execute from the start, we're effectively going to see that the status come back as like a 202 or a 202 equivalent. From the actual service, it would probably usually give us a status like 2XX. And then it's saying this is the data that's been updated. So the service itself defines the structure in the return. So right here, we as acting as the service, we're going to return the comment. So we're going to return the data that they've uploaded, which is quite common. And then the status, which is review received or 202 review received or whatever. So let's say 200 review received. Let's save, let's rerun. And this will now come up as 200 review received. So they'll have a structure that they'll conventionally send back, and it will tell you that structure in the API docs. Okay, we're getting on to the more complex concepts now, which is all about headers and auth. And yeah, think about it like showing your identity card to prove that you are who you say you are. You don't want people accessing your accounting information without proving that you are them. So for example, here, what we've got is there's a secret dish on the menu, and we want to get information about that secret dish, but it's actually behind a password. And what we would do is send a header, but the best way to do this is actually to add it in the authentication type. Like I showed you just now, we take a credential type, add it as a header. This would work in exactly the same, but let's assume that in the API documentation, it's called a x-API-key, and this will always be in the API docs. And then let's say our API key, as an example, is your API key, for example. And if we get that right, then the service is going to say, okay, this person is allowed to access the data and give us that data back. If we get it wrong, then it will not send us that data back. So we've got this if authorized chain here to show you this example. So inside the webhook, you can see that we've got the endpoint, which is secret dish. And then we're effectively simulating whether it's authorized or not by saying, actually, if you have the right key, which is actually if the API key on the request is equal to this, and the service would be doing this in the backend in using much more complex methods, but this just simulates if the key received is equal to the key on the system that's registered to that user, then we're effectively going to respond with that. And if not, we're going to respond with an error. So if it's an error, it says you are not authorized. So let's test it out with an error. And let's just say, actually, we got the API key wrong, and we execute that step. Then the dish is going to come, or not come back, and it's going to send us actually an error, you are not authorized, which throws us back to these error message in here, which is effectively like a 400 client error, which is we've got something wrong, and it's actually no permission or unauthorized here. And then finally, we're going to cover some important concepts around additional options. So often when we're sending these API requests, we need to make sure that we are one, respecting rate limits of the service they're providing with us the data, and two, actually respecting our own software and infrastructure, making sure that these don't break. So we're going to simulate effectively an endpoint, which is actually, we've got this slow service. So actually the webhook here you see has a 3-second delay. So this simulates there's loads of requests going into a given service, and actually it's not able to handle the requests, and therefore it's slow on giving us information. But that information is really important for us to receive right that second. And therefore this one's actually designed to fail, because in our options or parameters down here, we've got this timeout, which is after 2000 milliseconds or 2 seconds, just don't receive any data, stop working. We're no longer interested, because the data is really important to receive that second for some reason. So if we start the tutorial again, you're effectively going to see that this is going to return with error, timeout exceeded of 2 seconds in there. And this is just saying that our fetch request for the information failed. Whereas if we change this to 1.5 seconds, you'll see that this probably succeeds now and pulls the information back, which is finally your food is here. So it's just showing the importance of different options down here. We have things like batching. So there will be rate limits on most API requests. You can't just continuously send data and bombard it. So it will reject you if you don't respect those rate limits. So let's say 50 items per second it allows, or any other quantity there. And then there's a few other options we can use, but rate limits and timeouts are the ones we're going to use most frequently. So that is it on HTTP requests and webhooks and how to use them inside n8n. If you need more information around those, then check out the school community in the description below. We've got way more in-depth resources around using these in practice. So that wraps up everything about HTTP requests and webhooks. Hopefully you've learned a lot here. If you like the content, then please give it a like below and subscribe.